The topic for today's discussion is fascism. Before I start delving deep into the various dimensions and nuances of fascism, one qualifying statement has to be made. Fascism can be looked upon both as an ideology and also as a movement. In fact, it has been explored more as a movement than as an ideology. Maybe because it lacks a coherent ideology, but more of that would come later on in my discussion on the topic. Let's start with from which source the word fascism was derived. The term fascism was derived from the Italian word fasces. It meant a bundle of rod with an axe blade protruding from it, and it signified the authority of magistrates in imperial Rome. And the word fascia means something bound. It came into currency, the word fascia came into currency in Italy in 1890, and it used to refer to a revolutionary socialist political group or band. But it was only in 1919 when Benito Mussolini formed the fascist party in Italy, the term fascismo, in English it means fascism, acquired an ideological meaning. But before we explore the ideological dimensions of fascism, a working definition of it would be in order. Since fascism is more of a political movement than a coherent ideology, giving it a precise definition is not an easy task, particularly from the perspective of its nature or character. Most of the available definitions have been derived from post facto analysis of the activities and pronouncements of various fascist groups and fascist leaders which were witnessed in Europe during the time between the two world wars. Such definitions have usually highlighted the principal features of a fascist political regime, and particularly which we could find in two specific countries, Italy and Germany. We may quote one such working definition of fascism. Fascism is an authoritarian nationalist political ideology that exalts nation and often race above the individual, and that stands for centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, severe economic and social regimentation, and forcible suppression of opposition. It often claims to be concerned with notions of cultural decline or decadence and seeks to achieve a national rebirth by suppressing the interests of the individual and instead promoting cults of unity, energy, and purity. So this definition is more or less comprehensive. With that definition, we may now start in right earnest, delving deep into the origin and development of fascist ideas and organizations. If we look at the European history, or maybe the history of ideas which we found in Europe of the 1920s and 30s, we find that the fascist ideas took shape mainly in the 20th century, particularly in the period between the two world wars. And this came, in a way, as a reaction to the principles and practices of liberalism on the one hand and socialism on the other hand, both of which emerged mainly during the 19th century. Fascism, from another angle, could also be linked with the conservative ideology that came in the wake of counter-enlightenment movements which the world witnessed in Europe since the 19th century. So, in a way, it was a medley of ideas deriving or developing mainly not on its own but as reactions to prevailing ideologies and prevailing principles. With in this major incident that perhaps left a mark in the history of fascist ideas was the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the subsequent establishment of the first socialist state of Soviet Union, and also the humiliating defeat in the First World War of Germany and her allies, the insulting terms of the Versailles Treaty, which imposed huge reparations or financial compensations which Germany had to give to the victorious powers. It ultimately led to some kind of a national shame, out of which there was a reaction. The first organized fascist political party we could find in Italy in 1915. It was named as the Fascist Revolutionary Party and was founded by Benito Mussolini, and Mussolini eventually renamed the party in 1921 as the National Fascist Party. Mussolini became the Prime Minister of Italy in 1922, and by 1926 he was successful in establishing a one-party dictatorship in Italy. Closely following on the heels of Mussolini and his fascist party was Hitler and his Nazi party. In Germany, in 1919, an avid nationalist by the name of Anton Drexler established the first German Workers' Party. Hitler joined German Workers' Party soon after and very quickly rose to the ranks of its frontline leadership. Sometime in 1921, Hitler renamed the party as National Socialist German Workers' Party. This is a rather longish name, and the more popular is a shortened version which goes by the term the Nazi Party. And in 1933, Hitler was elected the Chancellor of German Reichstag, and by 1934, Hitler was successful in establishing a one-party dictatorial regime in Germany. So that is the history of the political movement, fascist political movements, and the development of fascist political organizations and parties, with which the development of fascist ideology was very closely linked. Now, it naturally brings us to the question why we could find the rise and emergence of or development of fascism at a particular period of time in Europe. Unless we go into that, it will not be very easy to understand the nature of fascism as an ideology. Andrew Haywood, in his excellent work called Political Ideology, has catalogued 4 or 5 factors behind the rise and development of fascism, both as a movement and as an ideology. The first was that in most parts of continental Europe, democracy was a new force, and democratic political systems were being just established in most countries of the mainland Europe. And also, democratic values, both political and social, were yet to find a very deep or a strong root in such societies. The initial confusion that accompanied the change over the regime from erstwhile monarchical to newly established democratic led to political uncertainties and instabilities. And in this atmosphere of political uncertainty and instability, one needed a safe anchor, and that safe anchor was promised by the fascist movements and the fascist political parties. The second factor which Haywood mentioned was that due to the development of capitalism from late 19th century and mostly from early 20th century, the middle class or the lower middle class found itself increasingly squeezed between the rising might of the big business and the increasingly organized strength of the newly formed working class. Thus, this section, this lower middle class section, found in fascist promises, in fascist leadership, some kind of a escape route from getting somehow wiped off if things continue the way it is continuing. Thirdly, the Russian Revolution and the coming up of the first socialist state created a fear in the minds of the propertied classes that they might ultimately lose whatever positions they had, and with it their social power and privileges. That made them turn towards the fascist parties which promised to follow anti-socialist principles. Fourthly, the worldwide economic depression that we could see in the 1930s, starting first in the USA and then spreading to the whole Western world, led to rising unemployment and severe economic problems for most of the working class or most of the toiling people. They also became a very solid base of support to the emerging fascist movements. And finally, the end result of the First World War, we all know that Germany lost the war, and this led to two kinds of reaction. One was a kind of a national shame, and which gave birth to an attitude of revenge, some kind of a ultra-nationalist revenge that they must correct the imbalances enforced on Germany by the terms of the Versailles Treaty. So out of all these factors helped in the development of fascist movements and fascist ideologies. Now, before we finally go into having a look into the fascist ideology, one thing I hope had been quite evident from the discussion which we had so far from on fascism, that fascism developed as an ideology more as a reaction, more as a negative reaction to other prevailing political ideologies, principles and practices. So it could be defined by what it was not by what it was. And from that point of view, historian Hugh Trevor Roper had found fascism to be an ill-assorted hodgepodge of ideas. Hugh also mentions fascism may thus be better described as a political movement or even a political religion than an ideology. Still, one has to catalog or identify a number of leading principles which together constituted what is known as fascism's ideology. And most of these principles, if we have to mention the two sources of these principles, could be found in the writings of two charismatic leaders of the fascist movements in Europe, Benito Mussolini in Italy and Adolf Hitler in Germany. Mussolini's 1932 publication of the Doctrine of Fascism and Hitler's autobiographical writing, Mein Kampf, provide us perhaps the only two written sources of what fascism stands for, and one has to glean and find from them the leading principles which guided the National Fascist Party and its movements in Italy, and the Nazi Party and its movements in Germany. One can also mention that at that time one could also find the development of some kind of a fascist political tendency in Japan, in Asia also, and a bit later, right after the Second World War, in Argentina, in Latin America. Now, fascism, if we may try to concentrate on its major principles of fascism, we can identify a number of major principles. To start with, the first one is nationalism or some kind of ultranationalism. And this nationalism was based on either cultural supremacy, as you could find in the case of the Italian fascist movements, or was based on the supremacy of the Aryan race that Hitler propagated in Germany. Second point which emerges was that of totalitarianism, that any fascist system is a totalitarian system, meaning thereby that the state regulates all aspects of individual's life. Every aspect. An individual has no existence or no independent existence, no power of deciding on his or her life on own, and the state standing above all individuals, all groups, lays down the principles which an individual has to follow throughout his or her life, and that is a totalitarian system. Thirdly, statism. State, the most important institution in the whole national system. Mussolini was quite eloquent on this point, that state is the ultimate institution and the most powerful, the most advanced, and occupying the highest position in any political community. That's statism. Fourthly, some kind of a patriotism which insisted on paying obeisance, paying a supreme respect to the fatherland, fatherland within quote. Both in Italy and in Germany, the term fatherland was very important. Elsewhere, it could be motherland, but fascism basically was a patriarchal idea. So it is not motherland, but fatherland. Autocracy, the rule of the leader, the single leader. Mussolini, in his doctrine of fascism, was quite clear on the point that the National Fascist Party or the Italian Fascist Party or the fascist system or the fascist ideology did not believe in any kind of democratic system, be it parliamentary democracy or presidential democracy. It didn't believe in the principle of numbers which democracy upholds. It believes that every system needs a very strong leader to act as the helmsman of the entire society. So it was unapologetically autocratic. Next would come some kind of a militarism. All fascist systems, mainly in all the leading ones, Italy, Germany, and to some extent Japan in Asia, they're all very militaristic in the sense that to them the ultimate power of the entire state structure was military power. They believed in military subjugation of all its opponents. They believed in being always prepared for war. They believed in amassing arms and weapons, almost harking back to the ancient Spartan city-state where militarism was prevalent. Corporatism. Corporatism means a kind of system in which different bodies which control various social and economic activities are not elected but nominated. And election had not much of a place. Election through which democracy establishes the majority rule had not much of a place in any fascist political structure. And they believed in having bodies where they could discuss or they could advise, but they should be composed of people nominated by the government itself, by the state itself, not people elected or representatives elected by the people themselves. So in that way, in a corporatist political structure, what is known as popular democracy was totally absent. Populism. I think this has become more or less evident by now that it depended on populism, on a very popular leader who time to time declares certain populist policy measures in trying to get back or in trying to strengthen the popular support behind the regimes. And these populist measures are often ad hoc, often playing to the gallery, and often trying to satisfy the basest instincts or passions of the masses. So that is populism. And finally, collectivism. Now, collectivism means that it's not the individual, but the collectivity. The collectivity is primary, the individual is secondary. The collectivity may be the state, the collectivity may be the nation, the collectivity may be the racial community. So an individual has importance only as a part of the collectivity. The interests of the collectivity mattered much more than the interests of the individual. So if we just summarize all these, that we will find once again, if we go quickly to the points raised here, that fascism as an ideology in fact stood on many pillars, and none of them could be called to be the core pillar in that sense, or the major source of strength. there's nationalism, totalitarianism, statism, some kind of patriotism, autocracy, militarism, corporatism, populism, and collectivism. All these combined, and on the top of it were a very apparently popular, very demagogue, a leader, be it Mussolini in Italy or Hitler in Germany. Incidentally, both Mussolini and Hitler were very good orators, and that's one of the basic requirements of being a demagogic leader. At the same time, fascism also stood in opposition to certain other principles. The first principle it opposed was liberalism. Liberalism placed individuals at the center of all the happenings, and that individual is not to be controlled either by the state or by the society or by an outside agency. So you can very well guess that liberalism will have no place in a fascist political system. It opposed communism, particularly it opposed the idea of working class superiority, of a working class state. It denied the concept of class and class struggle, though both in Italy and in Germany, the governments of the day under Mussolini and under Hitler in Germany often followed certain policies which could be called socialistic, but they were totally against the historical materialism. It was also against democracy. Democracy was gaining ground all over Europe. Maybe it had to take a few steps backwards between the world wars, but this is a great threat to the spread and taking root of fascist ideas. And it is also against any kind of individualism. Now, naturally, a fascist state cannot allow the individual to be important, an individual to feel that he alone can determine his life, or her life, and together they can determine the course of politics in that country, and that will mean an end to the autocratic regime. So this was basically, in a nutshell, the philosophical standpoints of Nazism, if we may call it the philosophical standpoint of fascism as an ideology. But fascism feeds on the frustration, disappointment, and uncertainty that occupies the mind of the ordinary people in times of violent changes, in times of changes which affect all of their lives. In the contemporary world, particularly with the rise of or the spread of globalization, life for most of the people or for most of the toiling masses has become so much insecure, not only in the poorer south but also in the richer or more advanced north, that they are suffering from a sense of insecurity. And in this mentality of insecurity, just as a drowning man tries to catch at anything solid and even a straw, similarly, in any such situation of spreading all-enveloping insecurity, which you find in the present times today, a leader or the leader often promises a better future. And therein lies the story of how fascism still survives as an ideology or as a principle in politics.